आज के सफदर हाशमी स्मृति व्याख्यान में आप सबका स्वागत है. On behalf of Jan Natya Manch, I welcome all of you to this 23rd Safdar Hashmi Memorial Lecture. Today's lecture will be delivered by P Sainath. Please give him a big hand.
Thanks very much, Mala. So I'm delighted to be and honored to be doing this lecture instituted in the name of my old friend. I have to say, if I'm to be honest, that close investigation reveals irrefutable evidence that there was one very successful surgical strike. It completely took out the spine of the Indian media while leaving the spleen and other organs intact. It didn't have to take out the brain because that had been lobotomized a long time ago. And that was done by the corporate owners, and this was done by governments. But it was a very, very good surgical strike. Any vestige of spine vanished in the last 30, 40 days. Many years ago, Professor Prabhat Patnaik made a very lovely presentation in the ACJ called The Media and the Market, in which he concluded that something has shifted. This was 15 years ago. Shifted in the moral universe of the media. What Prabhat said was that the moral universe of the media has shifted. Today, that moral universe is a different galaxy. Okay? And how much that shift has taken place, you can see in a number of ways. Just one very recent one, say 3 months, 4 months ago, you had the chief economic advisor of this country, the chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramanian, and Mr. Bibek, Professor Bibek Debroy, chief advisor to the Rajasthan government, in what purported to be a debate with Thomas Piketty on television, in which Piketty said that inequality in India is desperately gaining ground and that you ought to worry about it. And the anchor threw in her 2 pence and said, Raghuram Rajan, you have to cite a certified authority to be able to justify your question. Raghuram Rajan has said that, people should not be flaunting their wealth, especially those who are in serious debt with public money. Both Debroy and Arvind Subramaniam poo-pooed the whole issue. They didn't think that inequality was something important, and Debroy said that if people make pots of money and they flaunt it, it's no business of ours. And the chief economic advisor to the government of India said, I'm with Bibek on this one. Yeah, he's probably with Bibek on everything, but I'm with Bibek on this one. Someone's flaunting their wealth, this inequality thing, it's not important. It's not our business. Even in the early years of the reforms, I promise you, even in the early years of the economic reforms, I'm saying early 90s, had the chief economic advisor to the government of India said that flaunting of wealth was not an issue at all, and that inequality was, Piketty was making too big a thing of inequality, I promise you, that person would have been looking for a job the next morning. It's how much your universe has shifted. There is no way that an economic advisor, chief economic advisor in the 80s or early 90s would have justified flaunting of wealth and inequality. But here's another thing. Most of us from the middle classes accepted it. It did not raise a big furor at all. Nobody wrote a single editorial. Okay? Nobody wrote anything, even on the opinion pages, saying that the chief economic advisor of the government of India believes inequality isn't such a great issue, believes that flaunting of wealth is okay. That's how much our universe has shifted. The media has shifted with that. The biggest and most important shift in that moral universe is driven by the material universe of corporate ownership. That's something we will keep coming back to in the next hour. So you have that. But you can also look at how the media have functioned. And for me, the ownership part is very critical. Who we are, what do we cover, who owns us, what are their interests, okay? Is the media some kind of independent, neutral entity, or who are they anyway? We'll come to that. But you can look at coverage of, say, in the last 2 years, of very major events, which are actually processes covered as events. You can look at, say, the coverage of JNU and the fallout of what happened there, how it was covered, where a couple of channels went after the university's progressive elements, created this national hysteria on anti-national and lack of patriotism and everything else. You can look at it in the completely inane and vapid way in which they have covered and continue to cover the murder of the three rationalists, Dabolkar, Pansare and Kalburgi, two of whom were known to me well. I didn't know Kalburgi, but of course Pansare was very well known to me, and Dabolkar as well. Where were those great investigations that you should have seen? Where was that serious digging? And that will bring me to another point about who runs not only the media but the country. Or you can look at the fact that how we have covered the fastest growing inequality in the world, which is happening in your country, greater than anywhere else in the world. India is not the most unequal country in the world. There are countries where inequality is greater, including, say, South Africa. Okay? There are countries where inequality is greater than India. But there is no country in which, between 2000 and 2015, where it has grown faster, no major country where it has grown faster than it has in India. Give you an example. I'll give you the numbers on it, and then we'll come back to this. Some of you have seen Oxfam's analysis of Credit Suisse data. Have you? Yeah? What does that tell you? It tells you that 10 years ago, 388 billionaires owned wealth equal to or more than half the population of the world. That's what the analysis by Oxfam of Credit Suisse data and Oxfam's independent analysis also of Human Development Report and everything else told you that now 388 became less than 100 5 years ago. As of 2015, the number of billionaires in the world whose wealth is equal to that of half the world's population of 3.5 billion is 62. 62. Okay. So 62. Now, I want to know, does that figure offend you? Actually, yours is a lot worse. That's the globe. In India, 15 individuals, 1-5, own a greater share of total wealth than half the Indian population, or 650 million people do. 15 individuals. What do the top 100 individuals own in India? They own what? The bottom 69% of the the Indian population own. How are these numbers derived? So one individual owns wealth roughly equal to all your Dalits and Adivasis put together. I mean, that would be 24% of the population. Right? So this is the kind of inequity. In 1991, you did not have a single dollar billionaire. Now you have 93. You have 93, which makes you fourth in the rankings of the world in terms of dollar billionaires. Yeah. Now, where does media come into this? All this inequality reflects massively in the media as well. It reflects in the ownership of media. It reflects in the content of media. It reflects in the last 25 years in the changed beats that reporters are made to cover. It reflects in the social and class background of journalists. When Appan Menon, Sujit Datta and I entered the United News of India and Ritambara Shastri, and I entered the UNI in the 1980. Appan and Sujit entered before me and Ritambara. We were the first MAs, MPhils to be in Indian journalism. 3 years later, PTI was advertising, no one, those with anything less than an MA need not apply. Now, as from the 80s, the structure of media started changing in ownership, in content, in beats. Who were we, by the way? Where the hell did we come from, the modern Indian media? You came out of the freedom struggle. And, I'm sorry for those of you who were born after the 80s, but there was something to be proud of in Indian journalism. There still is. There are still individuals who are, ripped apart, become freelancers because they get squeezed out of the mainstream media. They're delegitimized when they start. I'm not talking about myself. I had someone very specific in mind, and I'll come to that. The current editor of the Economic and Political Weekly, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, produced a book which I say without hesitation is the best piece of investigative journalism on the Indian corporate world that I have seen in 15 years. Absolutely the best book. I strongly recommend that every one of you buy it and read it. It's called Gas Wars. As the book is in process, one publisher after the other pulls out. Right? So Paranjoy self-publishes the book. By the way, that's why publishing houses like Leftward matter. Paranjoy ultimately self-publishes the book. I believe he sold 20,000 copies, which is remarkable for a self-published effort, even for a house-published effort. It's a remarkable thing. And it's out in 3 languages. It's selling in all. Nobody wanted to touch it, and he got a notice for 100 crores. This, by the way, is the urban intimidation tactic. I'll come to the rural later. Now, nobody believes that you're going to go to the court and make him pay 100 crores, of which he doesn't have 1%, or 0.1%. What is the meaning of that? The meaning of the notice to Paranjoy is a signal to every other journalist. Don't you dare. Just as the FIR filed against Neha Dikshit for the trafficking story in Outlook is not so much just about putting Neha Dikshit behind bars. It's a warning to every other journalist. When I broke the paid news story and people were speaking about it, I believe even Arun Shourie got a notice. And so one is that this is one track of intimidation. There are others. But the power of corporations to sue you and break you. Now, once you're under that kind of a threat, your hands are tied. Publications don't want to use what you're doing because you've become controversial. Yeah? And so you get stuck worse and worse and worse in that thing, you become a kind of outcast within the media after a while. And there is no doubt that your next story, you're going to think about this. You can't write without thinking about that legal notice. It is going to have an impact on you. Okay? But there have been very brave individuals who have got it, who've had their FIRs, their notices, everything else. And this happened in the paid news scandal also, which I will come to again in a minute. But let's look at how what we covered changed, and then I'll tell you the numbers on what we cover. In 1980, when I walked into the United News of India, every journal, every newspaper had a labor correspondent. Every single newspaper had a labor correspondent. Okay? I knew many of them. And from 1980s onwards, especially after that prophetic brawl that I witnessed, which took place in the UNI was far more famous for its coffee and its canteen than for anything else. And in fact, when Ritambra and I used to say we work for UNI, they would say, that canteen. But well, I think I like to believe we made some difference there. But anyway. So that fight took place there. Today, look at who your correspondents are, what you cover. There is no such thing as a labor correspondent. Labor is covered in the major newspapers. It's covered by a business correspondent who handles what is called the industrial relations beat. The business correspondent, who mostly functions as a spokesperson for business, is then going to give you the labor version also, which he gets from the PRO of the corporation. Because most of your business correspondents have never spoken to a labor leader in their lives. They won't know who the major trade union people in that city are, because they're not required to talk to them. They're not required. That beat went. The agriculture correspondent vanished. Something like the Yeti. Sightings are reported, but no hard evidence. And, well, there are a lot of people called agriculture correspondents. A lot of people called agriculture. They cover the agriculture ministry in Delhi, and they're called agriculture correspondents. Either in the states or in the capital, they cover the ministry. They don't cover the mandi, they don't cover the fields, they don't cover the farmer, they don't cover the farm laborer. And of course, they cover the seed companies, which is quite easy since it's all based on reproducing their press releases. And that's what's happened to the Now, no newspaper or channel today appoints a full-time agriculture correspondent or a full-time labor correspondent, but even a general newspaper can have 14 people covering business, various aspects of it. Okay, I used to know a guy in Mumbai who, when I was scraping on my freelancer's existence, his only job was to cover futures. Now it must have been I actually started out being very sympathetic because it must be the most miserably boring existence that you can, conceive of. But when I realized that he was earning 8 times what I did, I was a little more cautious in my commiseration. So that was the business correspondence. Look, when we say we will not have labor correspondents and we will not have agriculture correspondents, we are saying that 75% of the population are not worth talking to. They don't make news. That is the statement you're making. You're making that statement structurally by removing those beats. When Kisan and Mazdoor do not make news, they do, once in 5 years they do. And that's why you get such bad election reporting, because people go back to talk to people they've never seen. They're slumming for that 90 days of the campaign. Right. So it's not their fault either. It's not that reporter's fault either. He or she has not met such people and not been required to meet them on a steady, structured basis. So you're saying 75% of the population do not make news. Just take employment correspondent, take the labor correspondent. The average over the last 10 years of job seekers registered at employment exchanges in India, you know how much that is? 44 million. To give you a sense, 44 million is a numbing figure. You can't, let me visualize 44 million for you. 44 million, if you put the 44 million jobless or job seekers in a single queue, it would be 3.5, almost 4 times your coastline. Let's say 2 grown guys like me, 2 to a meter. You can't fit more than 2 of me into a meter. Okay? 2 to a meter is 2,000 to a kilometer. So you do the math, 44 million by 2,000. Go on. It's 3.8 something times greater than your coastline, which is 6,082 kilometers for the mainland coastline. If you include India's coastline, peninsular India's coastline is 6,082 kilometers or 6,087. If you include all the islands and everything else, then it crosses 7,000. We are not interested in that. Even then it would be 3 times. Okay? But that's the figure. We don't think this is important to cover. We don't think it's important to have a full-time correspondent. A country with one of the biggest homeless and housing problems in the world doesn't have a correspondent on that. We don't have correspondent. What do we do? What we do have correspondents for is glamour, fashion. My favorite, which I've always tried to get, is the eating out correspondent. I haven't succeeded. Yeah, but you don't have, in a country with the largest number of absolute poor, you have no correspondent looking at poverty full time. You have the most horrendous attempts to minimalize, trivialize the agrarian crisis by people who've never stepped onto a farm, never stepped onto an agricultural household, never been in one. Okay? Just know this. The average farm household in India, which is 4.9 people, round it off at 5. Average farm household in India, its income from all sources, this is an NSS figure. Income from all sources means from agriculture and from non-agricultural work as well. The average income of the Indian farm household is 6,426 rupees. Less than 1,300 rupees per person. You don't have a person to cover this. Yeah? A few good journalists write about it when the NSS round is out, when the NSS situational assessment of farmers is out, then people write about it. So what then do we cover? What is it that we do cover? Let me give you some of the numbers. And let me also tell you about the process worldwide. You know, the big story of 2009, 10, 11, the 2010, 11 was the gigantic BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Just about destroyed the Gulf of Mexico, destroyed half the marine life, everything else. The US Coast Guard then held hearings for which there was record attendance of reporters, journalists, everything. David Barstow of the New York Times attended these meetings and wrote a very good piece which appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review as well. He was completely taken aback. I would have told him not to be, but he was completely taken aback that the people with notepads scribbling and taking most copious notes in the hearings were not reporters but PR people, public relations officers. They had come to learn from the master. Because tomorrow they were going to be facing similar issues, right? They needed to know. So they were there not to ask questions, but to get answers, which they could use. The public relations people in the audience, in the note takers, vastly outnumbered the journalists and reporters. By the way, he is absolutely correct. It's not just true of that hearing. In the US, for over 20 years, journalism jobs, public relations jobs have been growing at almost a 3-to-1 ratio. PR jobs are growing almost 2 to 3 times faster than journalism jobs, and journalism jobs being shrinking has made the gap wider, but it was 2:1 even 20 years ago. That public relations, the same is true worldwide. Public relations jobs are growing much faster in India than journalism jobs. And I'm not counting all those journalists who function as PR guys anyway. We're talking about the formal delineation between journalists and public relations people. So that's what happened with PR jobs growing much faster. In 2014, Time Incorporated, publishers of Sports Illustrated, of Time Magazine, all these, that huge stable, laid off hundreds of employees, 250 at a single stroke. And then a memo of theirs was published by Gawker, an offbeat publication, which, by the way, has gone into bankruptcy. And the memo was fascinating. It summed up brilliantly the idea of being politically free and imprisoned by profit. The memo actually produced a table with it. The story produced a table which they had got out of the memo. Journalists were ranked not on how good they were as reporters or what kind of stories they broke. They were ranked amongst other qualifications. My favorite part of the table, they had all these qualifications, right? Prolific writing, output, quality of writing. They had one column said quality of writing, and one said beneficial to advertising relationship. I loved it that the guy who scored highest on beneficial to advertising scored lowest on quality of writing. And the guy who scored highest on quality of writing was second from the bottom in beneficial to advertising relations. But here was a giant corporation telling you that this is what we are about. The memo was leaked, and of course Time said it's out of context. They didn't deny that it was there. They said it was being misinterpreted, etc. It's absolutely the same in our media as well. Okay? It's absolutely the same. Who owns what? What do they do? Now, come back to Mukesh Bhai. We love him so much, so we keep coming back to him. There is a gigantic difference between media monopolies of 25 years ago and media conglomerates of today. There's a huge difference.